Now back to our main topic, learning disabilities. That's a very confusing subject. What should we actually know about this subject? I mean, there's all kinds of variations, opinions, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. What's your take on this?
Well, the longer you study this, the more confusing it gets.
Oh, yes.
First of all, we work very well with special needs children. We've been working with children that have ADD, Asperger's, a variety of hyperlexia, dyslexia. The ones that are more difficult to work with usually are autism children. It's not difficult to work with them one-on-one, but to put them in a group situation can be very hard for autism
We've
children.
had quite a few in our class over the years.
We had some borderline autism children. We had a lot of children that had full-blown Asperger's. That was not a problem. We had a lot of children that had Down syndrome. They're usually not a problem at all. We had a lot of children with ADD. I mean, that's probably one of the most commonly diagnosed in learning disabilities nowadays. And of course, it's not nearly as severe as Down syndrome, let's say, right?
Yes.
And we make some. We're going to in the later segment of the show. We can share a little bit with the viewers what the results have been with that. But let's talk about ADD and ADHD for a moment, because it afflicts so many people. Now, even the Center of Disease Control says that it's about 4 to 5% of the population that has ADD.
Oh, wow.
Okay, but you have to count into that the fact that many ADD diagnoses are misdiagnoses, and that's not really disputed much. And the reason for that is that there is no objective test available. In other words, you can't plug your child into a machine, you can't hook up an EKG, you can't do a chemical test to figure out whether or not the child really has ADD. And of course, this is not only is this the most prevalent issue, it's also the most controversial. So really, there's one side that argues that there really isn't, that ADD doesn't even exist. There's the other side that insists that it doesn't exist. So almost any time that you're trying to seek help for your child, you're going to find yourself in the middle of two sides that are arguing about the subject.
Exactly.
Right? And so that leaves you even more lost. Right?
Yeah, because parents really, that's the last thing they want to hear, that their kid has ADHD and
right.
And
Usually, a good parent, right? I mean, there are some parents who welcome that because they can abdicate their own responsibility. They're saying, okay, there's nothing wrong with my parenting, my child has this disorder, right? So there's also that issue that sometimes a parent can have the wrong viewpoint on this, right? But in general, assuming that you're watching the show, you're probably a good parent that wants to get more information.
Yes.
So, well, the first thing you should know about ADD and ADHD is that if your child does get diagnosed with it, there is a 50-50 chance that diagnosis is probably a misdiagnosis.
I've heard that from parents before too, a lot of their times. That their kids
and this is regardless of whether or not ADD really does exist, or whether or not you believe that there should be medication for it or not, because most people are on extreme sides of the fence for that one.
And
right?
a lot of these kids that we see are extremely smart.
Yes. Many times, gifted children get diagnosed with a learning disability. A gifted child, a child that learns very rapidly, is going to become bored in class, is going to probably not sit still that much. I'm sure all of us have had the experience of being in a lecture type situation where it was just a subject that we knew so well that it was really hard to sit still and participate because you wanted to go on to the next challenging step in the subject, let's say, right?
Exactly.
But even without that, the way that a professional or anybody will diagnose ADD is by looking at symptoms. That's the only thing left. If you can't measure it any other way, you can only look at symptoms. Well, here's the problem. First of all, that's a subjective test. That means it's somebody's opinion, right?
Yes.
Somebody's opinion. Now, of course, you can argue that, all right, well, but it is a psychiatrist's opinion, and that psychiatrist is an expert. And then, of course, you have the other side arguing, well, okay, well, that's a one-sided view. Just like a surgeon will recommend surgery, and a chiropractor will recommend, an adjustment, and a herbalist will recommend, a dietary change, let's say, right? So a psychiatrist might be more prone to actually diagnose a child with ADD just because that's the world he lives in.
Now, quick question. We always talk about this too. It's if you do have a type of learning disability, it's not anything you can just shut off. If you have
yes, that's the first thing to look at for your child, to see whether or not your child was diagnosed properly or not. First of all, before you ever have your child diagnosed, I would check whether or not your child is really exhibiting the same symptoms in all situations. In other words, if he's doing fine at school and the teachers are not complaining, and he's defiant at home, well, ADD doesn't turn on at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. right?
Okay.
Unless, of course, it was a medication wore off. That's a different issue. But if your child has selective ADD, then he doesn't have ADD, right? And all you got to do is you can pay attention to what your child, how your child behaves when they are doing something they enjoy, how they interact with other children, how they play a game, for example, anything that they enjoy. So that gives you an idea of what the child's true capacity is. When the child has to do something that they don't enjoy as much, let's say their homework, now if they suddenly have a problem of focusing, it could be is actually much more likely that they have difficulty with a particular work, right? Maybe misunderstood words, or maybe something that's just too difficult for them, right? That's a different issue.
And I know we're going to touch on it in the after the next break, because we've actually had a lot of success in dealing with a lot of these families, and we've had a lot of children that were misdiagnosed or are doing much better in
Absolutely.
school, at home.
Absolutely.
Like
The good news is that you don't necessarily have to know if your child has ADD or not, because usually you know what the symptoms are that you're dealing with. In other words, let's say your child, and even, by the way, the symptoms, there's arguments in the field about that amongst experts. One side says that the symptom means that your child cannot maintain their attention for more than, let's say, a few seconds. The other side says that, well, actually that's not true. The true ADD means that your child stays focused on one issue and has a real hard time having some mental flexibility to then change to another subject, right? So there's argument amongst that. So even the experts don't agree on what ADD truly is.
And you talked about the percentage of 5%?
According to the CDC, it's between 4 to 5%.
So would this be ADHD would be more common right now as a...
Yes, it's the leading learning
else?
disability. Yes, it is a leading learning disability.
Okay.
But again, that is assuming that the diagnoses are correct, which it's already pretty much shown that the diagnoses a lot of times are not correct. One big issue regarding this, there's what we call imitators. In other words, there's other conditions your child can have that would make your child exhibit the exact same symptoms.
Oh, wow, that can be very confusing.
That can be very confusing. So it's going to look like your child has ADD, has all the symptoms of ADD, but actually it's something else. One common condition that a child can have that's going to look just like ADD is depression. And you can find articles on this all over the internet, but that's actually been first, I think there was an article back in 1995 that first brought that to light, and since then there's been much more confirmation of that. But especially with a child, the child being depressed looks different than an adult being depressed. But there's a lot of other, and that's considered an imitator of ADD, so to speak, right? And the even worse news is that sometimes ADD medication.
Oh, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, conflicting opinions on that.
Very much so.
Is it good? Is it not good? I mean,
Absolutely.
You see these children kind of zoned out sometimes. Well,
Absolutely.
should they be on
Absolutely.
it? Should they not be
Absolutely.
on it?
And there's no doubt some medication definitely improves the child's behavior. But the one thing to consider is that even when your child gets misdiagnosed, sometimes ADD medication can temporarily alleviate the symptoms.
Doesn't solve it.
It doesn't solve it because you still had a misdiagnosis anyhow. And then, I'm not a medical doctor by far, so I cannot really attest to what the medication does. That's why we are more on the other side of the field. Where
I believe when it first came out, it was very. Now I believe they're using a different. They actually have learned to experiment and kind of
yes.
tone down the medication.
Yes, there are continued new efforts to come up with new medication. Ritalin is very much out, and now